Okay, I think we can begin, and it's with a lot of pleasure that I'm introducing Professor Rob Iliffe today, who's a professor of intellectual history and history of science at the University of Sussex. Professor Heitning has been working on early modern science, and in particular on the connection between religion and science in the early modern period, and even more in particular on Newton, Isaac Newton, the scientific and theological work of Isaac Newton, and I would say he's one of the leading experts of Newton and one of the major contributors to the Newton industry today, and which is still flourishing, as you know. And in this sense, he has been editing an extremely useful tool for those of us who work on these topics, which is the early biographies of Isaac Newton in 2006, and also a kind of most effective and beautifully concise, very short introduction to Newton of the famous Oxford series of the very short introductions. And I'm actually delighted to say that I've seen his book, High Priest of Nature, Theoretical Life of Isaac Newton is forthcoming. And so I cannot wait to read that. And also, I think I'd like to point to your attention, just in case you don't know that, other side of his persona, who's the director of the Newton Project, which is this amazing online project, which is an extremely ambitious project of putting everything that Newton ever published or wrote without publishing it online, available for free for everyone. And as you can imagine, is a massive enterprise, and I think it started around the year 2000 and is still going on. I think there is still much work to be done, and I think this is an instrument that is already and will even more so in the future revolutionize, or let's say affect very profoundly the Newton scholarship, just for the simple reason that you will have these amazingly diverse productions all together for the first time. Because of course the committed Newton scholar could explore the alchemical writings or the religious manuscripts in the past, but now they're there for any graduate student to be used, right? And connections could be much more apparent and visible than they were in the past. So I think that's just a most interesting and I think it would be an extremely influential working tool that is not just about organization of materials, it's about really a qualitative shift in Newton scholarship. I also understand this is a very expensive project, and maybe I think Rob could tell us a little bit more about the funding situation of the project, sure. Which could make for an interesting conversation. So I just leave the floor to him. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, Massimo. Yeah, we can talk after the talk. We can talk more about the digital side of things. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. There's a lot of text in this, and there are pictures as well, which is nice, but there is quite a lot of text, and I hope that doesn't distract from what I'm saying, but one needs a little bit of background. I wanted to say at the beginning that what this talk represents in a way is the capacity generated or facilitated by the Newton Project to read deeply, not just engage in distance reading, but to use these giant data sets to read deeply and to find or locate putative connections between different areas of Newton's research. Isaac Newton is famous. He's a dead white European male, one of the most famous and influential. He's born on Christmas Day 1642 under the Julian calendar, after Julius Caesar, and after January 1643, according to the calendar of Pope Gregory. His father died before he was born. There's some quite interesting work being done suggesting that he may have died in the civil wars. His mother left home in January 1646 to live with a local vicar, Barnabas Smith, who lived less than 2 miles away. I mean, all these things one could talk at length about what that could possibly have meant, but it's unclear to me just how distant she is. Newton later on remembered her as being completely different and living in a different house. And Newton was brought up by his maternal grandmother. He's precocious and independent. It's not just me saying that. He has an ethic of independence that he tells everyone about. No, I didn't mean that as in a pejorative sense. I mean that it is absolutely essential for him that one makes one's own way in finding the truth. His mum returns in 1653 after Smith's death, and he has 3 half-siblings who he periodically hits. And he has problems with them because we know this from a list of confessions he wrote at Whitsun 1662, where he listed all the sinful things he'd ever done, there aren't many. I mean, most of us would be reams and reams of pages, but he only has about 40. Nevertheless, they're very interesting. And he goes to Grantham Free School in about January 1655. And I put that in there because he doesn't spend much time with his mother. She gets rid of him not long after she comes back to stay with him full time. I think he's a difficult person to live with. This is Woolsthorpe Manor. The famous apple tree is at the front. I don't know how that comes out. It's okay. Yeah. So he arrives at Trinity College in June 1661. There's a traditional curriculum, a strict religious discipline. Some of the work I've been doing over the last couple of years has been trying to find out just how strict that is. There's a kind of intense Foucauldian regimen that these people are subjected to, and I think it's inconceivable that any student at Trinity College or some of the neighbouring colleges did not subject themselves to that discipline. The list of confessions shows Newton is devout. He has a Puritan morality. He's not a Puritan as such. I mean, he's a member of the Church of England, as many Puritans are, but he is a precisian. His life is bent around ways of reforming the Church of England to come to terms with what Newton himself believes. He's an anti-Trinitarian, and I won't talk about that, but it's essential to understanding him that he's always an outsider, that he hides his true beliefs from his closest friends. The discipline in Trinity is about work. There's a specific style of this work ethic. Idleness is the devil's cushion. Students are spiritual ants, gathering and laying up food for their souls. The point of Trinity College, as the masters always say, is to breed divines for the Church of England. That's the sole point. This is not like some European universities where, you know, oratory is important. At this stage, you know, becoming a priest in the Church of England is the fundamental focus of Trinity College and many other colleges. It's better to be a young saint than an old devil. I like that one. Newton, what would we say? He abides by the traditional Aristotelian curriculum until some point at the end of 1663. Early 1664, he enters this new world of the new philosophy, and he engages in research programs that lead to his discoveries, which make him famous, or at least 3 of the 4 discoveries. Calculus, the heterogeneity of white light, and his work in physics. He lists a number of topics in an early undergraduate notebook called Certain Philosophical Questions that he writes up. He begins to write halfway through 1664. So he's still in his 3rd year as an undergraduate. And he starts reading works like Descartes' Principia and Henry More, the Cambridge Platonists' Immortality of the Soul. From Henry More, he takes some notes on the body. And this is the key thing I think I want people to understand, is that a great deal of his early research projects are not on mathematics or light or on physics, but they are actually on the body. About a third of, or a quarter to a third of his work in this book is about the body. So when he reads Henry Moore's Immortality of the Soul, he's got some really wonderful notes here. I don't know if you can read at the top, but I'll just read you some random thoughts. They tell you what Newton is thinking. The senses of diverse men are diversely affected by the same objects according to the diversity of their constitutions. A lovely one here. To them of Java, pepper is cold. So he's trying to think of the relativity of taste, the relativity of the relativity of being in the world. Different people experience things in different ways according to the constitution of their body. From Moore, who's taking it from Descartes, he tries to work out where the soul is, which part of the brain is the soul. He thinks the soul is in some part of the body. There's a list here of different parts where it might be. Then as we go down to about halfway through, there's experiments on frogs. What happens when you cut off the nerves that lie between the chest and the brain in a frog? What happens if you gradually take away parts of a frog's brain? And then going down a bit, some fascinating ones. At the bottom, a man can't see through a hole made in his head by a tree pan. What he wants to say, I think he's saying in there is that you need eyes to see. You need optical instruments to see. So the soul sees things by means of the eyes, but the soul can't see things directly. And you can tell that because if you, as one does, if you drill a hole in somebody's head, you can't see through it. Now all that stuff is in Henry Moore's Immortality of the Soul. Other things he's fascinated by are sleeping and dreaming. And there aren't many in this particular note, but these are wonderful, and these are rich notes. They're deceptively simple. How is it that the soul so often remembers her dreams by chance, otherwise not knowing she had dreamed? As it seems as if the soul is perpetually employed in sleep, even while you're awake. If you like, an unconscious part of the soul is involved in generating dreams. Are dreams from the body or the soul? Why are they patched up of many fragments and incoherent passages? This is the beginning of a research project for Newton, and I think it's the most significant research project that he has as a young man. A key research project for him is about the imagination. He's fascinated by the faculty of the brain that generates images, which is called the imagination or the fantasy. And he takes some notes from Henry Moore and from one or two other sources. But if you think about this throughout this talk, you'll see this is actually autobiographical. He's taking these notes, but the selection of them indicates something that's autobiographical. We can fancy the thing we see in the right posture with our heels upward. So right at the top. This is about the best way to enhance the imagination, the faculty of the imagination, which is the faculty of invention. It's the faculty of inventiveness and creativity. How can we maximize the efficiency of this? Well, he gets from Henry Moore and others, we can do it in the right posture with the heels upward. Fantasy is helped by good air, fasting and moderate wine. But it's spoiled by drunkenness, gluttony, too much study, which is fun. And then whence and from extreme passion come madness, dizziness, commotions of spirit. Meditation heats a brain in some to distraction, in others to an aching and dizziness. Okay, and then here, this is from Joseph Glanville's Vanity of Dogmatizing of 1661. And this is the focus of the first half of this talk. A man by heightening his fancy. So somebody who trains up his imaginative faculty to be the best it can be, may bind another's to think what he thinks. All right? So you can engage in sort of telepathic control over other people. So it says in Glanville, as in the story of the Oxford scholar. Right. Now, why is Newton interested in that? This is the Vanity of Dogmatizing, 1661. This is the the part where Glanville says that there's in which there's a technique by which one can enhance the imagination so much that the power of the imagination, which extends throughout one's body, actually goes outside the body. It's as if the extent of the body is an arbitrary barrier to the way that the imagination can function. You know, telepathy, telekinesis is possible. Let me just say before I talk about this that the Oxford scholar story is basically a scholar experiences poverty at Oxford in 1659, and he goes on a roundabout tour. He comes across some so-called vagabond gypsies who have a mystery, a mastery or a secret knowledge, and he becomes a gypsy in order to learn that mystery. One day, a group of other Oxford scholars whom he used to know are wandering by a gypsy camp, and they see him and they say, we know who you are. We're going to tell the gypsies who you are. And he says, don't tell me. Don't tell them, and I'll tell you my secret. And they go off to a pub, and the Oxford scholars who have come upon the gypsy scholar speak for a few minutes while the guy goes out of the room. And when the guy comes back, he says, I know exactly what you've been saying. And he tells them exactly what they've been saying because, as he says to them, I dictated what it was you said. And they say, oh, well, do tell us what you know. And what Glanville takes from this is that it's possible. It's a matter of fact. It's a robust, warranted matter of fact. So when Newton reads this in one of these modern texts, he takes it as a truth. You can heighten your fancy so that you can control other people's thoughts. And the first set of experiments that we have are of Newton trying to heighten his fancy. If you can see here, after the motion, so what he does is he looks at the sun. What he thinks is the way to do things is to look at the sun and really make the spirits in your eye go around at a rate of astonishing knots. That's how he thinks you should do it. And he's actually taking some information from Robert Boyle's book on colours, which had appeared in 1664. But he looks at the sun through a coloured prism. Because if you look at the sun directly, you'll go blind after about 10 seconds. Unless you're in England, when it'll take about 30 seconds. So he does this, and I don't have time to go into detail, I think, but he repeats the experiments again and again and again. He looks at the sun, he does it with one eye, he does it with another eye, and he writes, this is at the dawn of scientific writing, he writes down exactly what he did. After the motion of the spirits in my eye were almost decayed, so that I could see all things with their natural colours, I shut it and I could see no colour or image till I heightened my fantasy of seeing the sun. So what he means by this is he's caused severe damage to his optical nerve. But what he can do now, and this stays with him until the end of his life, because he reports this to somebody in 1726 when he's 83. He can still shut his eyes and call up an image of the sun. And the language of heightening his fancy, this is on the same page, by the way, as the notes from Glanville. So this is a direct experimental test of what is in Glanville. He's trying to, it's obvious he's trying to whip up, to develop, to train his fantasy so that he can engage in this kind of control. I do recommend, if you want to go, you can see this on the Newton Project website. I don't want to be a huckster all the time, but we have got this wonderful relationship with Cambridge University Digital Library, where they put up the images, which is where I've got these from, and we do the transcription so you can search for them. So just type in CUDL Newton and you'll go straight to this kind of stuff. Now, he does this for a long period of time. I won't go into too much detail on this. But he really destroys his sight for a number of days. There are many interesting things about this, particularly the fact that he keeps redoing the experiments in a very rigorous way, and there is nobody in the early modern period who does stuff like this. There's nobody who does this, this kind of experiment on the self, and he's an undergraduate. He's not even in his final year. I think he's in his penultimate year as an undergraduate. And he engages in a series of, you can make your own assessments as to what kind of pathology he's suffering from in doing this. I don't think he is, but I mean, this is really excellent, good science. It's a research project that has a focus. Towards the end of the experimental run, he says, when the impression of the sun was not too strong upon my eye, I could easily imagine several shapes as if I saw them in the sun's place. At this moment, he's lost control of his imagination. Stuff is now coming into his imagination. He can't stop it coming in. He's lost control. He can't, it's not just a question of him willing images. It's not just a question of him dredging up a picture of the sun. Stuff is coming into his brain. Because that is what the imagination does. It's capable of operating on its own. Several shapes appeared as if I saw them in the sun's place, whence perhaps may be gathered that the tenderest sight argues or is evidence of the clearest fantasy of things visible, and hence something of the nature of madness and dreams may be gathered. I take from this that this is a project about dreams and madness. This looks like a scientific project about telepathy and telekinesis, but it's also an attempt, and he lacks nothing in ambition. It's an attempt to understand the physiological basis of madness and dreaming. This is just a wonderful text. I just love this text because he keeps on going. He keeps on going, and he does more experiments. You may have seen some of the pictures of him with they're quite well known, where he gets a bodkin or a piece of metal and he sticks it in his eye, and he thinks of everything outside his soul as an instrument, as an organ that is a focus of really ruthless scientific attention, which is kind of, it's magnificent scientific sacrifice from one point of view, I suppose. And the way he thinks, he's saying that the tenderest sight argues the clearest fantasy of things visible, and then immediately he's, right, I don't know if you can see right at the bottom, he's trying to generate a tender eye. So, you know, he's trying to deal with madness and dreams by generating those kinds of experiences. That's what this guy is like as an undergraduate. He's got a research program that is much bigger than just what we think it is. So it's not merely all of light, mathematics and physics. Oh no. It's about madness, dreams, and the entire corporeality of the self, plus also the power of the soul. I'd also add, for those of you that know anything about Newton, and I do say this in the book, that these are the origins of his thinking about God. Because when he talks about God, he is trying to come to terms with the analogy between the human sensorium and the divine mind of God. And I don't have time in this talk to talk about it, but we can talk about it afterwards if you like. The most famous comments by Newton in the 18th century are about the world being like God's sensorium. And the way in which he analogizes the relationship between human beings and God is generated, it's the presupposition of that original research I've just been describing, but it's also the outcome of it. And he doesn't give up that research. Let's go into the care of the self, which is the second part of the talk. One of Newton's friends is a man called John North, Master of Trinity College, 1677 to 83. We have a wonderful description of John North and his problems by his brother Roger North. I mean, it's a wonderful, beautifully detailed account of North's descent into madness through overwork. I don't know why I kept the bit about him being effeminate, but well, you'll see it. Actually, you'll see a picture of him there. That's him. That's him as a young man. that's him 2 years before he becomes master of the college. Not a 13-year-old boy, as in fact he looks like, but somebody in his early 30s. Whether that's effeminate or not, I leave to the audience. But he has this ethic, this care of the self, which is one according to which he devotes himself to perpetual thinking. Roger described his brother as a martyr of study, and there's this, I think, funny and touching description of people trying in the last few years of John's life to get him to drink, to maybe even get a wife. John's having none of that. As a master, he is allowed to have a wife. He's the only person in the college who can, but he's not having that. He's told to drink sherry and sack and other things, and he won't drink enough. And then there's this famous time when he disciplines two loutish Trinity undergraduates, and he dies. And there's the story that Roger told that he asked for his gravestone to be at the front of the college so that the fellows could trample over him in death as they had done in life. Now, Newton and John North were good friends, and John North famously claimed that if Newton had not been able to engage in alchemical experiments, he would have killed himself through study, just like John himself would do. And Roger North said in a very, very touching piece that John could not see in himself what he clearly saw in others. Newton leads what he thinks is a balanced life, a care of the self. He lives between what he calls vicious extremes. When he dies, people try and write the life of Newton, and they find it very difficult to describe his care of the self. And Newton himself, we'll see that Newton has a very developed theory of how one should engage in the care of the self as a quasi-monastic scholar, but he's very careful to tell people towards the end of his life that he had not led a regulated life. And that's for two reasons. He had not been a slave to a regimen, and he had not lived a life that was like that of a Catholic desert father. He had not led a life according to which he was a slave to routine. He was free. He was formally free, but he led a balanced life between extremes. Newton does exhibit a care of the self. People who knew him saw that he would take something called Lucatello's balsam as a prophylactic to fend off. It apparently cures everything, and it fends off everything like rabies, gonorrhea, which in Newton's case is irrelevant. But he would every month he would make a quarter of a pint of this concoction, which is honey, wax, some residue from dead bats. They're the usual stuff. Right? And he would drink it. He would drink it regularly. It's quite common if you look at the correspondence of John Locke and the correspondence of John Evelyn. I mean, Evelyn's apparently saved his own child's life by giving Lucatello's balsam after the kid had choked on a fishbone. It's quite a common thing, although if you actually look in detail at the recipes, what's in Lucatello's balsam differs from one person to the next. But that's the way it was in those days. Newton is also famous, of course, for a lack of care of the self, as if he didn't care about how he presented himself. I mean, that's another kind of side of the presentation of self. You know, he doesn't dress properly. He's absent-minded. He doesn't sleep properly. In fact, he never sleeps. He doesn't eat properly. I mean, the stories we have all come from Newton himself. So all the stories we have of Newton originate from Newton. The mythologies, which are obviously based on the standard view of the scholar or later the genius, all come from Newton himself. So Newton generates his own legend about his lack of care of the self. Now what's interesting is, and we only discovered this because of the Newton project, I think, is Newton left an extensive text on how to lead a virtuous and devout collegiate life. It's in Latin. Now, I said at the beginning, colleges in England are largely seminaries for training priests in the national church, the Church of England. Fellows agree not to marry, and they take vows of celibacy. They are bachelors. They're people who have chosen to be bachelors. They live in a community of bachelors, and I think this is very important. They live in a quasi-monastic environment, but they're, on the whole, deeply opposed to Catholic practices of the self, to Roman Catholicism. They have to product differentiate themselves from the kinds of people who were college fellows at Trinity. Well, Trinity was never a Catholic college, but those members of colleges who were in Catholic colleges, you know, the people who originated the university collegiate system. Protestant bachelors have to product differentiate themselves from those forms of life. Newton's an anti-Catholic. It just saturates his entire view of religion and his entire view of the history of the world. It's peppered with a radical anti-Trinitarianism. He thinks Catholicism is idolatry, and he thinks that worshipping Jesus Christ as God is the purest form of idolatry. But he thinks that's Catholicism. The purest part of Catholicism is Trinitarianism. That's how the two are linked. It's about idolatry. For Newton, in his early writings, and we don't have a great story about how he managed to find the time to do all this, but this vast swathe of about 2 million words of writings in Latin, which no one had looked at, they're mainly on monks. And he thinks monks are the originators of all the evils that happened. John Kenyon said that Jesuits were the Waffen-SS of 17th century Catholicism. Well, monks are the Waffen-SS of 4th century Catholicism as far as Newton's concerned. Monasticism he sees as a counter-religious institution. It's diabolical. Monks are diabolical, monasticism is diabolical. And as I said, there is this extraordinary text which we have translated, and if anyone wants to write to me, I'll give you a copy of the translation, which is coming out in about 4 months' time. But it's an extraordinary piece. I mean, just reading over it again, it gets me excited. It's about chastity. Newton thinks, like many Protestants, that monks and indeed Catholics hold chastity as the highest ideal, but the pathways they recommend to achieve it can only produce its opposite. The general idea is this: it's modelled on the last temptation of Christ, that for Catholics, and particularly for Jesuits, to be a true militant soldier of Christ, you have to let carnal thoughts, give them a chance to come into your life. You grapple with them, and you will suffer, you'll be bloodied by it. But after a long time, you will conquer them. And, you know, as Nietzsche said, allegedly, whatever doesn't destroy you makes you stronger. The true soldier of Christ for Jesuits are those people who've grappled with temptation like Jesus and have conquered it. Newton says that Catholic hagiographers represent combat with temptation as heroic, and they make out that the earliest desert fathers conquered their temptations. But if you look carefully at what they say, as Newton does, you see that they succumbed to the imagination. The monsters of the id got them. They were not strong enough to deal with their imagination because it is too powerful. Newton thinks that, because he has a very low opinion of Catholics, he thinks that Catholics deliberately lie about the chances you have of conquering imagination, because of course it kind of warrants allowing temptations and carnal thoughts into your mind. Newton, sorry, I spelled intercourse wrong. I mean, that tells you something about me, doesn't it? He writes many pages about the desert fantasies of old dirty men, and they are dirty. I mean, one of the things about the Desert Fathers is they do play up their dirtiness and the fact they're sun-dried, like raisins. All the people that Newton reads there's the wonderful line that you see often in Protestantism where Newton says, much of the fantasies of the Desert Fathers are too disgusting to write down. But in the services of truth, I'm going to write them all down. So the monk Pachon, one of the first monks, he has visions of being licked by hyenas. Then he's overwhelmed by an Ethiopian girl with whom he has intercourse. I'm told by historians of this period that having sex with an Ethiopian girl or girls is one of the most common fantasies of the period. And then lastly, a snake, in his mind, a snake devours his genitals, perhaps because he's been a bad boy. But Pachon has this view every day and every night. He's tormented by this. The monk Pachomius, he has visions of extraordinarily beautiful, but as Newton says, disgustingly nude women. And Newton said, and I think in a wonderful turn of events, Newton says, look, all these people claim that the devil made them do it, but it's their own imagination. It's themselves. The power of imagination is making them do it. Many of the other great heroes, so all the great heroes of Catholicism are people who, you know, either foolishly or deliberately expose themselves to the excesses of their own carnal imaginations. I had to put that in. This is from the 1956 film, The Forbidden Planet, but this is the monster from the id because, as you may know, the machinery of the Krell realizes or concretizes the hideous fantasies of people. So basically, this is that monster is these guys fantasizing about the daughter of Morbius, who's the person on the planet. Anyway, you should go and watch the film. But I like the name, the monsters from the id, because that is exactly what Newton calls them. They are the monsters from the id. He doesn't use the phrase the id, but that is what he's talking about. And Newton goes into a lengthy riff about the imagination, which we have seen before in his early undergraduate writings. Can you train the imagination? Well, you have to be careful with the imagination. Tiredness, disease and hunger inflame lust, which Newton says is constantly supplied by the imagination. Frequent fantasies will inevitably result as an outcome of a deviant corporeal regimen. And in this line, he explicitly, I think, in this chapter, he explicitly reworks his Questiones, that's the name of the original document from 1664 to 5, he reworks that material to talk about both how one can engage in a deviant corporeal regimen, but also how one ought to live. So this is not just a slugging off monks exercise, because interspersed in all this, there are, I think, remarkable accounts of how one should live one's life as a bachelor. Let me just frame this slightly by saying, there is a view held by many people, and some in this room, that Newton was gay. And he has a relationship, which I'll talk about a bit later on, an emotional attachment, not a relationship, that begs the question. He shows interest in a young Swiss mathematician called Fatio de Douillet. And people have argued that this shows that Newton was a repressed homosexual. I think this material shows that he's not. I think this material is autobiographical. The material looking at is about these monks is totally autobiographical. Right? He wrestles with women all the time. And this is, in a sense, his working out on paper how to avoid the torment of thinking about women. How can you avoid thinking about women? The beast of sin, he calls it, can only be avoided by flight. Fasting, like monks do, sickness, so you know, fasting yourself into sickness or overeating so that you're sick will make you, will mess up your head, which is a phrase he didn't use. Taking oaths to God, saying that you're going to be continent, they don't work either. Because thinking about chastity is the worst thing you can do. Thinking about being virtuous will immediately bring into your mind its opposite. So you can't think about being carnal, nor can you think about being not carnal. You have to not think about being carnal. I think in a very interesting passage he says, look, these monks had no books. They were alone either by themselves as desert fathers, as solitaries, or they got into communities of like-minded people. Being on your own, without books, without some distraction, will make you think about women. Monastic ascesis inflames desire and ultimately produces what he calls, in a wonderful phrase, a mass of fornicators. I mean, the term fornication appears again and again in this text. Now, here's a wonderful quote. This is just it's not a random, it's the best quote that I could find for just conveying what Newton is talking about in this text. So, effectively, he's saying, and he does use this term, that, you know, we want as scholars to produce a useful body. He actually says that. The body, we want to make a body that is active and fit for use, and idleness and lust corrode that body. You know, we have a vocation as scholars to promote Christian truths. In his case, he has a vocation to mathematics and natural philosophy. But this is how you live your life. Fasting and watching, so being awake, engaging in vigilance beyond measure, will only macerate your body. It renders the body feeble and unfit for use. It inflames it and invigorates lustful thought. The lack of sleep and due refreshment disorders the imagination and brings men to a sort of distraction and madness. So I take this to be a reworking of that very thing you saw earlier on. You know, madness, dreams, imagination. This is a repositioning into an anti-Catholic discourse of those thoughts. It brings men to a sort of distraction and madness to make them have visions of women conversing with them and sitting upon their knees. People think they're really there and that they can really touch them and hear them talk. And this quote goes on actually to talk about necrophilia and sodomy, and there's a wonderful phrase where Newton says, look, these people wrote down all this stuff about necrophilia and sodomy without blushing. It's a typical Puritan comment on some of this stuff. I think that the account is autobiographical, and it's stipulative. So it's autobiographical, it's a description of Newton's own situation, and it's stipulative in the sense that it's telling you how you should live your life. He may be telling himself, but it's still stipulative. Newton lived in a community of scholars all engaged in these kinds of practices, and some of the text that I haven't mentioned is about what happens when you go into a community and you've got dirty old men who want to listen to the confessions of younger acolytes. So Newton's got a wonderful sociology of how desert solitariness can become part of a cenobitic community of scholars. And of course, by equal steps, the critique of confession flows directly into a critique of modern Catholicism, with a critique of the sexual depravity, the inevitable sexual depravity of monks. And there's this extraordinary few paragraphs where he talks about how innocent young men get dragged into this and they become lustful rustics become lustful monks, is the conclusion. You know, we're not expecting, by the way, from this man, we're not expecting an unbiased account of Catholics. Right? This is a man who is energized by a deep dislike of anti-Catholicism and everything that he thinks it stands for. But in this particular text we're looking at, it is about the corporeal self and about the imagination as well. The imagination is something that can be controlled. This is Fatio, the delightful young man who I don't think Newton really had any sexual attraction towards him. Now there's a letter that he wrote to John Locke in 1693. Isaac Newton had a breakdown in 1693 and he wrote to two of his friends who you will have heard of, the diarist Samuel Pepys, who he accused of being a lackey of the Catholic King James II, and this more interesting letter to John Locke. And neither Pepys nor Locke had known that Newton was harbouring these thoughts until Newton wrote to them apologising for having had these thoughts about them. Now, he says, being of the opinion that you endeavoured to embroil me with women and by other means, I was so much affected by it, as when someone told me you were sickly and would not live, I said it would be better if you were dead. That's one of his best friends. In fact, arguably his best friend. And, you know, Locke, I think if you look at the rest of the letter, and indeed the letter to Pepys, you can see there's independent evidence for each specific condemnation of Locke and Pepys. The only one we don't have specific evidence for is this one. But because each of the others is backed by independent evidence, I have no doubt that Locke tried to put Newton into a position where maybe he could hook up with some wealthy woman, and let's just say it wasn't a good idea. And actually, you can see at the bottom, I beg your pardon for my having hard thoughts of you for it. And you can imagine John Locke getting this letter. Okay, so on his deathbed, Newton allegedly confessed to being a virgin, which I think he was. There's no evidence of any homosexual inclinations. In fact, he condemned sodomy quite a lot in his writings, as you would expect. There's substantial indications that these autobiographical elements extend to his own visions of women. And his was the life of a celibate bachelor who chose celibacy. I mean, one of his key points about the Catholic priesthood is that they're forced into it. And, you know, part of Newton's own ethic is that one does things through one's own will, that one chooses one's own celibacy. And I think that's why he doesn't like what Locke has done. Locke has really put him in a difficult position, and, you know, I just think that the evidence is absolutely clear that Newton has these visions of women, these dreams. His is the life of a celibate bachelor. You know, we want to know what this bachelorhood is like. The answer to his problem is that the answer to his way of dealing with carnality and with the imagination is to avoid occasions of sinning. Now, it's very important for Newton that his hands are always at work. I mean, if you go back to what John North said about Newton, if Newton had not done his alchemical experiments, he would have killed himself with study. I think that there's a reason, that one of the reasons he does this stuff is to divert his thoughts away from his own sinfulness, from his own, from the thoughts inside his own head, because that's what he says in these texts. You know, the only way that you can stop these things rushing in is to be busy. As the title of Richard Westfall's great biography of Newton says, the only way you can, well, I mean, in a different context, but I take it to be the same thing. The only way you can be virtuous and achieve things and to be a good Protestant and to be the best you can be in your vocation is to be never at rest. At various moments towards the end of his life, he exemplifies this ethic by saying, you know, basically, I'm not a genius. He says this on a number of occasions, you know, everything that I've ever done, you know, my greatness, I mean, he's not averse to saying he's great. My greatness is because I thought about things continually. And he valorizes to an immense extent those people who have sufficient learning to grapple with a problem. He uses the term grapple, to grapple with a problem until the problem is solved. That is a comment about his own self, I think. And as a sort of facetious point at the end, I wonder whether his great work is all done to stop the torment of his imagination. And there is the great man himself at the age of 60, not looking a day older than when he was 45. Thank you.
Okay, just open up the